welcome to the SSI Orbit podcast, a forum for conversations that explore the ever-growing ecosystems of self-sovereign identity. And I'm your host, Mathieu. So I wonder sometimes if history is repeating itself or if we're operating in a context that we're just not aware of. And an example of this is like a goldfish doesn't know they're in water until they're out of their context. So is history repeating itself, or are we operating in a context we're not aware of? And do technology advancements provide new realms? And so, for example, like there's been a lot of talk about this metaverse concept over the past little while. So does technology provide new realms, or are they simply tools for existing realms and existing power dynamics that exist in the world today? So what I'm hopeful today is these very big topics are all things that we could start just unpacking and uncovering slowly through this conversation by just taking a lens on history as well, just trying to understand through different examples in histories, through different examples of how people viewed their context or how technology advancements happened, how power dynamics shifted throughout history. Hopefully it can help us understand our present a little bit better and help us, I guess, predict the future. And so we'll be dialing back in this conversation a little bit to go over some interesting examples throughout history that can help us here. And so I'll start the conversation off, Tim, just talking about context a little bit. That was the first point or first sentence I was making here, that goldfish don't know they're in water until they're out of their context. What defines our context, and why is context so important in life?
Yeah, well, I guess I could answer it pretty simply, like context is everything. Next question. But I think it's deeper than that. Like a context, consists of the circumstances that we exist, not only physically but socially, and like many other factors as well. And I think the important thing about context is to try to understand what you take for granted, and also not to project your assumptions and sometimes your implicit assumptions onto other contexts and judging other contexts of history based on your current assumptions. And the work that I've been doing over the past number of years, especially when I was within government in the role of a central agency, being part of a central agency where you're developing policy and you're looking, you have to look at the longer term. You have to focus on outcomes. You have to understand the situation that you're operating in, and it goes beyond just like a operational context, if you will. You have to look at societal context, technology context, the classic, what's that called, the PEST analysis: political, economic, social, technological. The more aware of it you are, I think the better equipped you are to kind of sift through the noise from the signal. I think the other thing too is a lot of times we, as I said, we take things for granted. Like when we see something written on a piece of paper, for example, like now digital, but when we see something written on a piece of paper, we think that that's the authoritative thing, that piece of paper, like whether it's a money or driver's license or whatnot. But, if you go into it more deeply, that piece of paper or that banknote is just a representation of something that has been agreed upon between either you and another person, or you and the state, or it's an assumption. Yeah, sometimes what I find, like with technology, and again, I feel like I understand the technology to a reasonable degree. Sometimes we get wrapped up in the embodiment of things as opposed to understanding what those things actually represent.
I think it would be interesting to talk about the mental model that you've been trying to create recently. I guess the new model that you created with the context and the rules and identifiables and countables, does that fit into better understanding context?
Maybe I'll give a bit of a background on that model. I'm involved with some of the working groups and task force with the Trust Over IP Foundation, specifically the Trust Registry Task Force, and before that it was, I believe it was the Technical SAC Working Group. one of the reasons, motivations for me participating in those working groups is, yes, for sure, I can contribute, but it's a way of actually developing new knowledge and new models, if you will. And a lot of times when I listen in on the discussions, it really energizes me to actually come up with some simple conceptual models that I can work with, that I can reason. And kind of my rule of thumb is models, for sure, they can be complex, they can be elaborate, they can be like tons and tons of details. I'm sure everyone's seen slides where there's, let's see, entity relationship diagrams or process flow diagrams, and there's hundreds and hundreds of elements on the slides, and you look at it and just say, okay, well, that's nice. I really can't do anything with that mentally. I have to kind of work through it procedurally, or I have to kind of externalize my thinking. I've always been of the view that everything can be modeled like very simply with a few blocks, if you will, like block diagrams, and from that you can build out. So like, okay, where do I take my inspiration from? Like I look at, there's a few models that probably people are familiar with, and I'm always a big fan of models that help reconceptualize everything. And if I kind of go back into history, more recent history, like Claude Shannon coming up with the concept of information theory, and basically there's a simple block diagram of a sender and a receiver, and then there's transmission, and then there's noise that gets injected into the system, and that has to be filtered out before the receiver can actually interpret it. And that simple model, you know, I'm oversimplifying the process, but Shannon came up with the insight that information is really just the reduction of uncertainty. And when something's certain, if you and I, Mathieu, if we know a fact, you know, me transmitting that same fact to you is really, it's not information anymore, because you know it already. And information, the way that Shannon conceptualized it was, you know, given a set of possibilities, if you can reduce the possibilities down to something, to a finite set, then that's information. And what Shannon accomplished was he reconceptualized information, and that gave rise to the digital age. It was Shannon that came up with the idea of a bit, 1 and 0. That was the fundamental way of communicating information, and it was basically reducing uncertainty. Like, is it going to be 1 coming next, or is it going to be 0 coming next? And then there's a whole bunch of math, if you will, that enables redundancy. You know, he kind of came up with the idea when he was doing crosswords, and discovered that you can actually complete crosswords, because when you have words that are missing letters, usually the possibilities are not totally random, but constrained to a few possibilities. And that really put him on the path of what we call information theory, or digital information theory. Before that, with the telegraph and radio, like the way that the approach to actually communicate information was to like pump up the amperage. And you know, this was a time with overseas communication, with telegraph, radio, and I guess television was starting to come about as well. You know, the idea was to make a more reliable signal, was to pump more electricity through. And of course, like all the tubes and everything burned out because it just didn't work. And so there was a hard limit there. But when Shannon reconceptualized it as a bunch of bits and with redundancy, it just totally changed the paradigm. And then, of course, with the introduction of the transistor, like boom, boom, you have the digital age. So I take inspiration from that model. You know, going way back in I wouldn't say go back, like a few centuries, like Newton came up with a simple model of, you know, the 3 laws, you know, the classical physics laws of you know, the first law, force equals mass times acceleration. Second law, I might have them mixed up. The first law is in conservation of inertia, and the second law is oh my goodness, it's early in the morning. You know, the three laws. But what Newton realized, you know, there's that you know, it's probably an apocryphal story about the apple falling from the tree when he was pondering this. But, you know, he saw the apples being attracted to the earth and realized that the moon was being attracted to the earth. And then he started to figure out, you know, there was the universal law around gravitation. And what that did, his law or his observations basically collapsed like the earthly realm and the divine realm, or the heavenly realm. The prevailing thought at that time was that you had the earth and its domain was around you, and then you had the heavenly realm, which were the stars and the moon and the planets, and they were separate realms. But then what Newton came up with his equation said, no, it's all together. It's all in this. It's in a singular realm. And of course, like the religious authorities at that time, and again, I have to go back and just make sure I have my history right. They really had to rethink this notion of the divine. What exactly was the divine realm? Like, it's not like a Ptolemaic kind of universe anymore. And then, of course, you have Copernicus. What's called the Copernican revolution, etc. So I do not claim that the work that I'm doing or modeling it has any comparison to those like great thinkers, but it's always been an inspiration for me to actually try to take our complex world and kind of reduce it down to a simple model that I can keep in my mind. And one of the models that I've been working on is that I've taken a lot of inspiration from, the 4-layer model, which the Trust Over IP Foundation has been really advocating. And I've kind of cast that into a more general model of governance or institutional structure, where I have at the top layer is the charter, which is actually rights and privileges and duties and responsibilities. We're familiar with charters as being constitutions and Charter of Human Rights, etc. And then the layer beneath that are what I'm calling covenants, which are basically agreements or promises. So that's kind of like the private law versus public law, which is a charter. And then the layer below that is what I call connections or relationships between parties. And then finally, the base layer is the commitment layer. That's where you actually register a commitment, or it's a state of being dedicated or obligated. And just those 4 layers, like I've been testing it and refining the terminology, finding it's a pretty robust model that enables me to kind of keep in my thinking memory or my working memory, how I can actually analyze like a context. And that's going back to our earlier discussion. So like, let's say the context is public sector context or a legal context. Let's say, for example, in Canada, we have the charter, we have a constitution, we have a charter of rights and freedoms, and we have legislation that basically flows from that as kind of a subsidiary to that. Then you get into covenants, which are basically agreements or business contracts and any type of legal contract. And then the connections is basically, the formal relationships you have between like employees and businesses, or between proprietors and other proprietors, or contracts between customers and service providers. And then the commitments are basically your signatures, or you being witness to something. And, it sounds like a lot of words I'm describing here, but the model is actually pretty straightforward. And, I'm finding that model is actually quite useful in kind of cutting through what I call the signal from the noise. If I can take something that's very noisy in a debate, and when I say noisy, a lot of what I would say is a lot of ancillary facts that may not actually help the debate or kind of distract the debate, and really figure out what the core concepts are. So that's kind of the 4-layer model that I've been working on.
Would you say that throughout time, people's context has been, you kind of referred briefly to the divine realm and the earthly realm, where in the past, the divine realm was perhaps influenced by the church, if we're just specifically talking about more of the Western world here. In each of those cases, and so if we go back in time and we see that the church back in the day had a lot of influence, and there was kind of a power shifts that would happen between the church, between different nation states, and it would kind of flip and flop over the years. But I want to kind of bring in the concept of the root of trust here alongside these different realms.
Yep.
Because throughout much of history, including today, there's been central administration within these realms, let's call them, if we could link them together, that have led to power, which have led to different cultures, which have led to different contexts. So it's interesting trying to go all the way back to the root of trust, because root of trust signals that something is centrally managed. And I think pretty much everywhere throughout history, things have been centrally managed at certain points in times and have over time been decentralized and re-centralized. And so it would be interesting. There's a lot to unpack here and bringing in a lot of different concepts together, but it would be interesting just to get your perspective on kind of what realms do we live in society today. I don't think there are many of them. And what realms did our ancestors live in, and how have they kind of evolved over time?
So I think you can distill it down to kind of two realms. There's the imaginary realm and the physical realm. And I just by way of evolution, how we've evolved, we've developed this facility of, I'll crudely call it the imaginary realm. We can actually think that there is a future. We can actually we can look at a symbol on a wall, whether it be a cave wall or on a piece of paper, and recognize that it can represent something else. And along the way, we invented counting and numeric systems. So like, I may have 3 sheep in the pasture, and, I might know each sheep by name and as individuals. But then, to manage a larger number of flock of sheep, registering each by name is kind of difficult for a shepherd. So the idea of numbers came about, where we could actually count and kind of not worry about the identity of the individual sheep, but actually look at the quantity. So we developed, whether it's culturally or through evolution, we developed this tremendous facility for the imaginary realm. And then along with it, we developed a facility for language, which basically is hardwired in our brains to actually be able to employ, the best term I heard is a generative grammar, which we can actually assemble things together to mean new things or to compute something. Like if you look at a sentence, for example, you can construct a sentence which basically can be like an imagined reality. Like you could say, the tree will be green in the spring. And just that construction, simple sentence construction, basically brings together our ability as a species to imagine the future and to imagine a specific order. And so you've got the imaginary realm, and then you have the physical realm, which is basically, using the forces of nature to meet your ends, whether it's just the other thing that we did as a species is actually create tools to kind of extend our bodies. We, learn how to make stone tools. We learn how to use sticks. We learn how to use spears, and it kind of that expands. So we could project our bodies through tools, and likewise, we learn how to project our imaginary realms through culture. Project them not only through a larger body of people beyond a tribe to a civilization, but also across time. And of course, what comes into that is the idea of, we developed some other like technologies like language and words, but then we figured out how to actually develop a system that enabled it to be actually transcribed onto parchment or into rock. And then we figured out how to come up with phonetic alphabets and construct words on paper or on a physical substrate. That being the underlying basis, like the physical realm and the imaginary realm, again, one might say it's a oversimplification, but, kind of dialing back to those two roots, and you're describing roots of trust, maybe roots of authority is the better way to describe it. And then you kind of look through history, I'll just pick a point in time to show where the battles kind of pitched off against each other. Like a good point in history is like the Reformation with Martin Luther, and again, you have like the printing press and the ability to print like the Bible in the local vernacular. But it was Luther that really said, this whole idea of purgatory and selling what are called indulgences, and the church selling indulgences or selling like cash for souls being put out, like taken out of purgatory, that's not right. And that was an accepted doctrine by the church, and then the Reformation basically rebelled against that. So it was a battle of the imaginary realms. And again, unfortunately, these things typically get settled through like the expenditure of blood and treasure, basically wars. So you have the Reformation as a great example. I would say kind of going a bit further back in history, around 1215 AD with King John. He was a pretty crappy king, pretty arbitrary, and the barons wanted to, and again, this is England, the barons wanted to keep his power in check, and they came up with the idea of the Magna Carta. It wasn't really considered a grand idea at the time, but the idea was that we are going to record, our rights and duties and obligations on a piece of paper, and we're going to codify things like there was a Charter of the Forest, which was, the forests in England were considered royal lands, but there were certain rights that people could hunt or not, or like the king had exclusive reserve over like oak trees and foxes and stuff like that. So this was all codified in the Magna Carta, the first edition, which only lasted for like a few months. But the idea of actually putting like rights and privileges and actually recording the rules, if you will, on paper, which even the king was subject to, was kind of another battle in the imaginary realm, which manifested itself in like a Magna Carta or various versions. I think there was 4 different versions, and basically that was the precursor to what we know as our constitutions today, and the legal system really started to evolve around that time as well. So some things, like fast forward today, we just assume the legal system, but all the concepts, legal concepts that we take for granted, or just assume that the lawyers can interpret it and exercise in our own interests. These are concepts that have developed over thousands of years. So, you take that lens, and again, just tie it back to your original point, Mathieu, like, a lot of the battles, or the power battles, is for supremacy, and you kind of strip away all the nicety things. At the end of the day, someone wants to be or needs to be in charge, and it's often a detente between the imaginary realm and the physical realm. And at one point in history, the church was very strong, like the papal church, the Catholic Church back in like the up to the 1500s. Before that, because everybody just imagined or agreed that the church had preserve over your souls and could excommunicate you and so on and so forth. That was pretty powerful hold over individuals. So the church had the control over the souls, while the kings or the states basically had control over your land, control over your people. And so there was like an agreement between the church and like the various states to basically, share power.
So without saying anything in the imaginary realm, like if we were to label it like that and place religion in there, not saying anything against like actual religion or anything, but just splitting up kind of where that fit versus kind of administration by the state, how has the imaginary or divine realm evolved over time? I think you've kind of touched upon the church or the Catholic Church kind of gaining the peak of their power in the, let's say, just call it, I don't know what year, but descending after the 1500s, let's say, all the way to today. How has the divine realm or the imaginary realm changed in our lives today? And is it still good, like, base framing to say we have these two realms? We still have the physical realm where, we still have our tools. We have, I guess, if you want to distill it down to math and physics on top of that, stuff like that. And then we have this other divine or imaginary realm. What does that second realm, divine or imaginary, look like today versus when the church, the Catholic Church, was at the peak of their influence on people, which obviously led to cultures and different contexts and stuff like that? How has that evolved to today?
I would say, let me just quickly say where we're at. Like, I view where we're at right now is we're in a period of the modern state. And I'll talk about that in a second, but just kind of going back to the historical aspect of basically the church. They were the technology providers of the day. The key technologies back like 500,000 years ago was basically literacy and recording stuff on paper. And hardly anybody was literate. A lot of the kings weren't, but it was the abbeys. Like, the abbeys really took off like in around 1000 AD. Just before that, like, you had the Benedictine order, which really started in the 5th century. You had the Franciscan order. You had these religious orders that organized themselves into these structures. Like, they basically had abbeys, or thousands of abbeys, especially across Europe. And again, this is European context. And they were the ones that recorded the knowledge. They were the ones that copied the books. They were the ones that maintained the manuscripts. They were the ones that issued what were called capitularies, like Charlemagne back in the 8th century. He had to govern the Holy Roman Empire, and he had to administer quite a broad array of sub-states. I'm trying to remember what the exact term is, and really had to keep a firm rule over the Holy Roman Empire. And one way that he did that was by issuing capitularies, and that basically was an order on paper saying this is how you're going to do things, and that would disseminate it throughout the empire. And so I said, like, the predominant technology was basically writing and parchment, and the abbeys were the technology providers. So fast forward to today, like, we're in the era of the modern state. And the modern state really came about with France and Napoleon and Richelieu, Cardinal Richelieu, coming up with the idea of, this is post French Revolution, that there was a modern state with centralized administration, centralized bureaucracy. The technology that was coming into the picture at that time, or had come into the picture, was basically gunpowder and guns, and it was basically France, I would consider, is like the first modern state. And they standardized, it was interesting, they standardized gun training, and they standardized language, and they standardized uniforms, and that enabled them to scale as an empire, or actually keep consistent control, and lay on top of that like centralized administration. And similar in the UK as well, centralized administration. And I would say, fast forward today, a lot of the bureaucracies that we have are creatures of centralized administration. There's a record keeping system. There's a decision making system. Yeah, there's decentralization to a degree, a subsidiarity to a degree. Like in Canada, for example, we have a federal jurisdiction, but a lot of the powers are devolved to the provincial jurisdiction, so which in turn are centralized in their own context. So we have this idea of the modern state with the centralized administration, again, with some subsidiarity. I think what's happening now is that, coming back to that model of the imaginary and the physical realm, there are media that support that enable the projection of like the powers in those realms to be projected not only into the future, but in different ways. And in the physical realm, it's basically, yeah, the physical stuff like cars and swords and ICBMs and rockets and tanks. And that's how you project physical power. In the imaginary world, it used to be parchment and ink, and then it moved to analog telecommunications, radio waves, television, telegraph, etc. And now we're moving into the digital type of medium. So, that's a pretty wide-ranging term, but you basically have all the digital platforms, the sort of the newer technological capabilities. I'd say the most significant thing that came along was asymmetric encryption in the 70s, and that really changed the balance. And looking back at the long arc of history, we're seeing this rise of the whatever is supporting this imaginary realm. Like as I said, it was mostly analog, but now it's turning digital. But now the recent developments, when I say recent, in the long arc of history, it's like 40 years, we have asymmetric cryptography that enables two individuals to communicate with one another without having a third party in the middle. And I honestly think we're only just seeing the beginning of fundamental changes that will shake itself out over decades. And who knows how things are going to play out. But coming back to, we are in the era of the modern state. Whether that continues to be the modern state, there's been reading some interesting stuff about we may be moving to what's called a network state, where it's independent of like a physical jurisdiction. But my view, kind of all bets are off. I think what's going to happen, like the institutions are going to adapt accordingly. And yeah, where that goes, I don't know. I can speculate, but my preference is not to speculate, but come up with some tools and some thinking tools that enable me to kind of ingest, the current trends or the current ideas into working models to actually then try to do some real stuff with that.
I think it's kind of clear to say that it would remain an imaginary realm, that however we want to call that. Technology is more of just the medium that will move that realm forward, but it seems like technology is the medium that will change the way that knowledge is captured or consumed by people. And by knowledge, we could talk about different claims that are made about different things in life, like someone's name, someone's address, and different balances that exist in life. And that kind of all takes us back to the root of authority. Like, and by balance, I mean like credits and debits and different assets that exist out today. And so in claims about identity, I think it's interesting to go back into history to see kind of how personal identities were created and how names came about. I think that's an interesting conversation as well, but it also seems beyond the claims on the balances side of thing, which both of these things falling under the category of knowledge. It's interesting to see how different balances have been managed over time as well, right? From the church to the state to perhaps, if we call it the network state now, there's a different way that people could kind of gain access to this knowledge, which could possibly downstream switch power dynamics between different entities.
Yeah. So what I would add, like my thesis, up until recently, as a society, we did everything like orally and verbally. Up until like writing is a fairly, and actually recording stuff on tablets and that is a fairly recent invention. Yeah, maybe it goes back like 6,000 years, 8,000 years or so. But as a species, a modern species, we've been around for like 50, 60,000 years, I believe, in our modern version as Homo sapiens. So, we functioned as societies, basically in small tribes, and our brains evolved to actually, as we talked about language and the way things were communicated. We figured out words, and we were effective, and we could transmit knowledge to our mates, our peers, to our next generation. And that served us quite well. But the thing is that we couldn't scale. So I'll quote that, what's it called, the Dunbar number, like anything beyond 150 people, like our brains can't handle anything beyond like social relations of about 150 people or so. After that, it really starts breaking down. Then when you start externalizing some of this stuff, like when I say externalizing, saying, okay, well, let's write it on a cave wall, or let's record the count on a stone tablet, or on a piece of on a piece of parchment, then all of a sudden you have the ability to start scaling. And the reason why many civilizations actually scaled, because they figured out how to record like debts and obligations and assets. Then you got civilizations that grew up based on that, or expanded based on that ability. And again, coming back to the imaginary realm is now being augmented by, or being scaled by, whatever media was being used at the time. So, I would say up until like the modern state, it was basically paper, and keeping paper under lock and key, and having people, only select people that could actually record that stuff, and that worked fine. And you could scale up to like it was fine for modern state, and that could be controlled, like registries and account balances and stuff like that. And now we're in a period of time where the digital medium is kind of going to the next level, which now we have these capabilities for, decentralized communication. We have the ability to do decentralized interactions, where the state can't be the intermediary anymore with cryptography and that. And so it's giving rise to kind of new arrangements, and where the modern state could project its power. In earlier times, that's no longer the case. Honestly, like I think the real lag is not due to the technology. It's understanding kind of what new models can be enabled with what the technologies can provide. And usually it's just like a very simple thing. Like a couple examples, the Bronze Age gave way to the Iron Age, and then someone figured out how to harden iron into steel. Iron's a relatively soft metal, but when you add carbon to it and heat treat it, it becomes like super strong. And someone figured that out, and then basically armor, and that basically was carbon steel. Another example is gunpowder, and the invention of guns or muskets or whatnot. Once that was invented and adopted, like anybody could pick up an arm and basically shoot a knight at a distance, like an armored knight. And so the armor was no good anymore, and someone could, with relatively little training, could take out a knight and his consorts quite easily. And so that was basically the fall of like feudalism. And as I said earlier, like I would say the first modern state to really take advantage of that was France, where they took the concept of gunpowder and guns and regularized that into a military, and regularized that along with other things like language and gun training and language training, to actually scale up what's required for a modern state. And now we're in, I would say, a phase transition period, that these new technologies are giving that ability to kind of go back to the drawing board and reorganize ourselves as societies and institutions. And who knows where it's going to go? I just don't know. But the thing is, like, for me, the lesson I've learned is try to look beyond the embodiment of the technology and really understand what's going on. And if you look at it over the time, like I would say human beings, we haven't really changed that much. We're wired to have a hierarchy, which is a fact of life. We're wired to ensure justice and fairness, and we're wired to maintain relationships and to honor duties and obligations, and we're wired to keep track of reputations. And so like our psychology really hasn't changed. It may be changing. Maybe there's going to be like some sort of evolutionary mutant gene that comes in that gives us a new capability. But I think that's going to happen over thousands of years. But what's different now is that now we've got some some capabilities like the phone in your pocket that go back like 20 years. Like that was the compute power of a nation state. You've got it in your pocket now. And that's going to change the balance. That's going to change everything. So I think this era of the modern states it's evolved over the past few hundred years, and sure, we can have incremental approvals, incremental improvements, but maybe for some things we need to go back to the drawing board. And I kind of where some of this thinking where I've been doing it a little bit more concretely is like in the world of digital credentials and verifiable credentials. Okay, yeah, so you have something that's cryptographically verifiable, and yeah, it's an incremental improvement over paper. Yeah, you can have it in a digital wallet. You've got better security and stuff like that. But okay, what's really happening here? Where's it helping? And then, as I'm sitting here, I'm looking at my degrees on my wall and going, okay, I remember when I had to apply for another position, I actually had to take pictures of these degrees. And well, I had them in the garage for years, and I finally pulled them out and got around to putting them on the wall after I pulled them out. But, I'm looking at these things and saying, well, what are these things? They're pieces of paper and there's a seal on them. But, there's an institution that's conferred some sort of right. I'm reading it with rights, honors, and privileges to a degree. So something's been granted to me. And that's what's important. And it's not the piece of paper that's important. It's not even the digital credential that's important, even though that's the more modern rendition of it. It's that right or honor or privilege that's been granted to me. And coming back to that 4-layer model, when I talked about a charter, like a university has a charter, typically from the state or the province or whatever country. They have a charter, and they've been given the mandate to grant rights and honors and privileges related to a degree. So there's the charter. And of course, then you can go down the stack. And I find that I can actually parse everything with this new model. And okay, so what does this new model do? It just gives me another set of thinking tools that, in the example of like digital credentials is saying, oh, this is more than a paper replacement. This might be a totally new way of doing things. And I don't know what that might be yet, but I think what's the most important thing is it enables you to entertain some new possibilities.
Started in the Middle Ages with the seals, where letter writers would use signing rings with unique engraved symbols and create these wax seals to prove the authenticity of a letter. So it kind of brings us back to, I guess, the root of authority, which everything that we're talking about here is just about knowledge, right? And I think you mentioned the power of asymmetric encryption, but I think that seems to be allowing us now to scale knowledge in a decentralized fashion, meaning not through some central administration. So yeah, we could scale knowledge in a decentralized fashion using new technology advancements like asymmetric encryption and all of these wallet technologies and decentralizing, advocating technologies. And possibly that shifts power because we're able to manage, again, the two things we're talking about here that are managed centrally today, claims and balances. So governments have registries of people's names and stuff like that. And central banks have balances of different currencies, and they manage that as well. So it really seems like who has the ledger has the power is is
Yeah.
core here. But if we're able to scale, and these things are all knowledge, if we're able to scale this in a decentralized fashion, where do you see the evolution of the nation state? You said earlier you think they'll find ways to adapt, but if they don't need to be in the middle of these things or to be the root of authority for these things, how do they kind of
Yeah.
evolve over time to keep adding value into society?
I look at it like history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, and this kind of corny adage is that history rhymes. And I think we're probably going back to a time like circa 1000 AD where there was this was before the modern state, but you had individual kingdoms, you had the church, and there was basically always a tension between these, and in the middle you had like the abbeys and the monasteries and that. And a book that really kind of blew me away, it's a rather academic book, but it really changed my thinking. It's called Forgery and Memory at the End of the First Millennium. There's a medieval scholar out of the UK called Levi Roach, and really looking at the idea of forgeries and authentic documents as they were produced around the time of like Emperor Otto, like around late 900s or so. The interesting thing is that the traditional scholarship back into that age was looking at it from a centralized administration point. Like it just presumed that like what they call diplomas, basically charters. Diplomas basically is any type of grant or donation. Like I would say that term is used more narrowly now for educational diplomas, but the term is more generic. Is a more generic term. You know, it was assumed that there was a centralized issuance authority that would take care of that stuff. And you know that was basically how the modern state evolved, and it was just assumed that that's kind of how it was done way back like 1,000 years before, and that wasn't the case at all. It was oftentimes it was a collaborative effort between the abbeys and the subjects that needed to have the diplomas issued. They were developed in collaboration, and then finally they would get the assent by the king or delegate of the king through some sort of formal ceremony. And sometimes it would take like years for that to happen after the document was prepared. And of course, this gave tons of opportunity for forgeries and counterfeits and stuff like that. But sometimes, you know, there was a discussion of what was authentic and what was a outright forgery. Sometimes, you know, there was no technology to make copies. It had to be like hand copied, and sometimes the monks at the time would say, okay, this was written like 5 years ago or 20 years ago, and we're kind of using different language now, so I'm making a copy. I'm just going to update it a little bit, but the intent of the document's the same. But then there's some other like charters or diplomas that are just like outright forgeries. The one, again, I was reading about this, I don't have all the detail, but it's the donation of Constantine. Basically it was I think it was the grant of the lands for the Holy Roman Empire. That was a complete forgery. So the thing is that the point I'm making is that I'm learning a lot from history, where I think we may be going back to a period of time where the projection of power into everybody's relationships by the state is going to be considerably lessened. But what's going to be different this time, 1,000 years hence, is that those intentions can be preserved cryptographically. And so you kind of take the risk out of the equation. You take out the funny business in the middle. That's where I am really putting a lot of my energy in understanding this, because I think at the end of the day, you know, I've come up again with yet grossly oversimplified trust framework. There's basically, I call it the 2-layer trust framework. There's the layer of intentions. What did I intend? And then the other layer is like, how was that intention conveyed? And those are the 2 layers. So the intentions are basically captured, like written on a piece of paper or on a digital document. You know, mathematically, an intention is basically expressed with a private key and a digital signature, or through a pre-image that's kept secret and a hash is exposed. So a lot of these cryptographic techniques that have been developed and enabled are doing things that we as human beings and as societies have been doing for millennia. Like you talked about, Mathieu, like the seal that was affixed to a charter. Basically, that was with wax, with a seal that was carved in a way or cast that it was pretty easy to see if it was a counterfeit or not, to make sure the document hadn't been modified. Typically what would happen is that a part of the parchment would be folded up, holes would be put into the document, and a string would be put through, or a rope or a twine, and then that twine would be melted into the seal that was affixed by not necessarily the king, but by his delegates. So you look at it and just say, oh, okay, that's really interesting. Like, instead of a digital signature, it's a wax seal. And the whole point of it was to like make sure that the intention that was expressed by the king was preserved. And then you look at the structures of the medieval documents and medieval charters. Boy, they basically have the same structure as a verifiable credential. They have what's called a front part, which they call a protocol, which means like the first page that has like the royal invocation. Then they have the main body, which is all the claims and rights and everything like that. And then they have what's called an estacotol. It's a word which means like the closing part, and that's basically where they have the king put their name and then their seal and dating it. And you look at it and just say, oh, well, okay, that's a verifiable credential circa 998 AD. So as I said, I don't think what we do as human beings has fundamentally changed over the millennia or the last millennia, but the technologies have changed, and it just kind of shifts the balance. And institutions typically kind of wrap themselves around the capabilities that they can provide, or like co-opt or monopolize. And so it's just going to be an interesting dynamic to see what happens in the future in general.
The word intentional is interesting here because it feels like obviously throughout time humans have had similar traits, and I would agree with you that we're probably not so different than early versions of ourselves. It's just that we're living under different contexts with different tools today that our ancestors didn't have. But I think forever humans have had values and beliefs and all these human traits, which at some point in time, the church would kind of influence what these were, right? Like as humans, we wouldn't have to think too much about our values and our beliefs. We're kind of told from the church how to act appropriately and what we should be believing and thinking. And with the power shift where the church in kind of that divine realm is not necessarily as influential anymore, I think the word intentional is still the case there. It's just where are our intentions coming from? And I think it's just a different architecture, right? And I think at the base, and I know you've written quite an interesting post on the power of architectures and why architectures are so important in shaping a lot of other stuff downstream. But it seems like it's just maybe an architecture shift in the intentional realm, if we want to just shift the divine realm to the intentional realm.
Yeah, I think you're bang on there. It's an architectural shift in the, and again, I'm struggling to find the best word for it, like imaginary realm, intentional realm. That might be the better way to describe the intentional realm. And we want to express our intentions and make sure that they're preserved, and then how they get kind of interpreted down the line. Like, you see this is where the legal profession comes into play, and if you start looking at the various legal instruments and legislation, like it's I remember doing work on electronic signatures, like, well, I don't want to date myself, but like over 20 years ago, and making sure it fell under like the Canada Evidence Act, and you read the Canada Evidence Act. It has some pretty good general definitions of what a signature is supposed to do, and how it would be honored. And then of course you get the regulations, which get more and more specific, and then you get technical specifications that get even more and more specific. And a lot of times what happens that people kind of lose sight of what the heck is this thing supposed to be doing in the first place, and are we kind of getting too lost in the technology and the nuances of the technology, which are important, but maybe not that super relevant for a context that we that we described. And I've boiled it down to, and again, you know, I like to have these oversimplified models. Like, you know, you look at, let's go back to a verifiable credential example, like a passport. What's the intention of a passport? The intention of a passport is to, you know, really to control the flow across the border of individuals. That's really, it's well, that's the modern conception of a passport. It used to be that it was something that would be safe passage within a country, and that's the case. That's still the case in some countries. But you know, the modern conception of a passport is to enable you to exit and enter a country. And there's agreements around that. And you know, the intention of the document is to enable that. But then it starts being used for other, you know, other objectives, what may or may not necessarily align with the intentions of the document. Like, and again, going back to my policy days, not speaking on behalf of the government or anything like that, like people were talking about passports being like a identity document. We said, no, it's a travel document. You need identity, but it's basically a travel document. And not everybody can have a passport. Like if you're not a Canadian citizen, for example, you don't get a Canadian passport. And or if you have like a criminal record or whatnot, you might not be eligible for a passport. So it's not an identity document, but it gets used as an identity document. So there's a situation where the intent of the document and the intent of its issuance is being, you know, what's the term, co-opted, not co-opted, but co-opted for another use. And that might be okay, or it might not be okay. So what I found is, you know, kind of trying to dial this back into some like abstract concepts, which you can provide some more concrete interpretations. You can say, well, you know, where we started this conversation, like, let's understand the context. You know, border crossing context is different than like being hired as an employee context. Or two different contexts. Border crossing context, you've got certain legislation in place or certain treaties, whatever. It's high risk because once you let someone in the country, you might not be able to get them out, and it's high risk to the state, if you will. The employee hiring context is different, and while the passport might be totally appropriate, if not mandatory in context A, it may be not necessary or actually prohibited in context B. Very same document, very same artifact. And that was one of the insights that I had doing the policy work, is that the same piece of information collected under one authority is completely different if it's the same piece of information collected under a different authority. And you just can't look at data or information without the context, because your date of birth being collected for a passport is completely different than your date of birth being collected for health, for a health service. And it's completely different from being collected if you're getting a criminal record or something like that. Same piece of information, but it's the context that actually defines how it should be used, disposed, disseminated, and whatever. And I realized that, you know, the information is important, the raw data elements, but what's even more important is understanding the context in which is actually being collected and used. You know, coming back to, you know, I think the theme of the podcast is that, and the interview is, it's really good to, it serves everyone well if you can kind of bring it back to some core simple themes, that people can relate to. And, one lesson I learned, like a number of years ago, I wrote a book and published a book of historical fiction. And I remember reading a lot of stuff on writing books and how to be effective and everything like that. And the one lesson I took away was that your book has to be about one thing. If you try to make your book about two topics, then people get lost. And but if you do have two topics in your book or two themes, those two themes have to be brought together into one theme, and then you're okay. But you need to have some sort of unifying theme that ties everything together. Otherwise, it's just a random collection of stuff, and people can't relate to it, and will lose interest. So coming back to like where my head is at is, how are we governing ourselves? How are we functioning as a society? How do we continue to function with these new technologies coming on board, especially the digital technologies? What are we trying to do? What are we trying to achieve? And like what I'm kind of distilling it down to is in that layer, that top layer of that model, is that we as human beings, we have rights and privileges, duties and responsibilities, and we have dignity. And we want that to be preserved as we conduct ourselves with others and society at large. And I think that's the most important thing. One might argue it's an individualistic view, and maybe there's an argument for more of a collectivist view. But my point as a human being, I have feelings, I have hopes, I have desires, and I cannot ascribe anything less to anyone else. I have to just look at myself and say, this is what I want as a human being, and this is what I want to get out of it. And the other thing is that the observer defines the model. That's how I'm an observer, and this is how I define the model. Someone else might define it differently. That's okay, but this is the way I'm defining it, and that's how I'm kind of identifying myself and defining these models. And hopefully it's consistent with the society that I live in, but it may not. That's okay. Then they can go through some sort of error correction routine. But at least there's a discussion to actually express these models and try to figure out what's right and what's wrong. And I just want to have something that works in my heart as well as in my head. That's kind of what I'm trying to do.
Just taking a step back to the architecture again, I think we're also familiar with administrative architectures, whether it's just in our day-to-day lives, where the nation state today has control over the centralized administration on many things, but it's quite similar in the identity space today as well, where we're quite used to administrative identity systems. And one of the things I was kind of thinking of as well is, as you're talking, there's probably too much focus on identity versus context. If you're talking about just a passport being a travel document, I think there's a lot of confusion about it just being an identity document. So maybe one lesson here is we should focus much less on identity, because that has led into things like our names becoming attributes when they used to be kind of the front running thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things that excites me a lot about how these new technology advancements or these new mediums are facilitating new architectures and allowing us to govern ourselves differently is just the separation of protocols from the clients or applications or platforms or wherever we kind of exercise our values, our beliefs, our relationships, our interactions. There's a separation there. So that for me is one of the most fundamental shifts that I see coming, which could have a lot of impact over how claims are managed, how balances are managed, how our lives work, is just through this fundamental architecture shift, which is happening under our eyes now, where through cryptography and technology advancements, we're seeing possibilities to really split off protocols from kind of how we interact and do things.
I'll admit, like my understanding has evolved over time. When I got into this business like 15, 20 years ago, I looked at like identity as more like from administrative and systems point of view, like username, password, and blah, blah, blah. Like I think everybody did. but then we evolved our thinking, and now I'm taking more of a right space approach. And identifier is not an identity; it's just a means of identifying. And then I'm also watching in real time. There's some fascinating stuff going on. There's this whole community of cypherpunks, if you will, like in the Bitcoin community, that's been developing this kind of new social media protocol called Nostr, Nostr, and I've been tracking that. I've been tracking it for. It's been around for like a couple of years. I started to track it quite closely about a year ago, and part of my motivation is that there is a community here that basically kind of grew up on like cryptography, anti-state positions, anti-government, and also really focused on like cryptocurrency or like Bitcoin. And this community is now starting to bump into identity with this one of the protocol geniuses basically created this protocol called Nostr. And it's so early days, but Jack Dorsey has gotten quite interested in it. And there's a podcast that is really great to listen to. Like Matt, if you can put a link into it, that'd be great. But one of the takeaways was, it's about the protocol, not the platform. And I would say in the modern state has developed these platforms for doing registers and services and whatever. Problem with platforms is that you can shut a platform off to a person, and this is exactly what's happening with Twitter right now. They're shutting out the third party clients that have been around for years, if not decades. And so now there's this thrust to say, well, we don't need these broad social media platforms, so we need protocols, and this is where a lot of energy is going into. And then they started to bump into, well, how do I know it's the right person? And so they created like some simple specifications for doing identification. And I started to look at it closely. In fact, like I've got my own little system that I've been working on. I actually implemented it and went, oh, okay, this is really interesting. And then also I've been trying to triangulate those discussions and debates to what's been going on in the decentralized identity community, the verifiable credential community. And again, coming back to what we talked about earlier on in the podcast, is that sometimes you're working with implicit assumptions, and you don't even know it, and so you design with those implicit assumptions. And then I started to see stuff. My motivation for tracking these groups was to kind of see how they debated things and actually use it to challenge my own assumptions. And I'm starting to change my conception a little bit. Like we talked about what you just said, Mathieu, about identity as a set of attributes. And it's like, maybe that's not the thing. Maybe we're short selling the idea of attributes, names specifically. And I started to go on this like sort of tear, or this going down this rabbit hole and saying, what's a name? And the conclusion I'm coming to, a name is something that confers rights and confers a reputation or accrues reputation. And the interesting thing is throughout history, like when a new king is proclaimed, or the popes, they get new names, like Pope Innocent, Pope Leo the 10th, or whatever. Pope Leo the 10th was actually someone from the Medici family. They get a brand new name, and that's how they're known by, and that's how they actually affix, whether they're signing papal bulls or like charters or whatnot. It's in the name of. And I've noticed too, just taking that perspective, it's the name that's important. It's not like the cryptographic material or the specific identifier. And sometimes the name, someone is signing in the name of something. It could be a king delegation or whatever. And then I started to look at this, and now I'm starting to come up with this idea that maybe the name is the important part. And then I started to look at like the decentralized identifier specification and some other stuff, and realize maybe that's not really a decentralized identifier. Maybe it's a name. And the identifiers are basically the cryptographic material, the public keys, the verification keys that can be rotated at will, that basically prove control of that thing. But it's the name of that that actually provides the reputation, or provides that the ability to provide the rights, privileges, and duties, etc. So I'm starting to think about it a little bit differently, and so I'm putting a lot more weight on like the decentralized identifier being a name, and even a Twitter handle is a name, and worrying less about the implications of the passwords or the two-factor or whatever. Those are just means to actually protect that name within the context. And again, bringing in the context, like the important thing is that King Henry VIII, in the realm of basically England, that was the king. And King Henry VIII in my household is like, I could call myself King Henry VIII. No one's preventing me, but that doesn't mean anything. And King Henry VIII, like, even though the names are equivalent, what's important is that it's qualified by that context, and that context has that those four components that I was talking about. So I'm just thinking about it a little bit differently. And as I said, like, I'm completely energized by the technology developments, but I'm also energized by kind of the new thinking that's being unleashed by these new technology developments, and actually causing me to kind of revisit my own assumptions and conceptions. And that's what I'm trying to work through.
I would like to start wrapping this up, Tim. We're getting up on our time. Are there any final thoughts or words or things that you would like to just throw out to listeners? Any call to actions, anything that you would like to just end on?
I guess the call to action for anyone is just like, be humble, look at your assumptions, try to drive out your perspective, realize that you're an observer of your own models, and you're making judgment calls, and based on your perceptions and biases. That's perfectly fine, but just be aware that there may be better ways or completely alternative ways, and just spend as much energy just rethinking your foundations, as opposed to like making your foundations even more ossified in your thinking. That's all I can ask.
Thanks for tuning in today. Hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. To stay up to speed with future episodes, or to catch up on ones you may have missed, make sure to check out the SSI Orbit podcast on your favorite podcast platform, and make sure you subscribe. If you have any questions, comments, or wish to see someone in particular on a future episode, you can find me by searching Mathieu on LinkedIn or Twitter. Feel free to reach out to me directly and I'll get back to you. See you all next time.